Armenia goes to the polls. Voters will choose between Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan, backed by Donald Trump, and parties that want close ties with Russia. So why are these parliamentary elections being so closely watched in Brussels, Moscow and Washington? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Anna Burns-Francis. All politics is local, they say, but sometimes not quite. In Sunday's parliamentary elections in Armenia, geopolitical rather than local issues are taking centre stage. The former Soviet nation has strong links with Russia, its biggest export market and energy supplier. But relations are strained as Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan seeks closer ties with the EU and the West. Endorsed by Donald Trump last month, the PM hosted a summit of EU and other leaders. But President Vladimir Putin has told Pashinyan he must choose between Russia and the EU. The outcome of the elections could have a big influence on that, as many opposition parties support closer links to Russia. So, why are Armenia's elections of such international interest? We'll discuss that with our guests shortly. But first, this report from Imran Ullah Khan.
In Armenia, parliamentary elections are offering voters a choice between two very different geopolitical camps. On one hand, a push towards EU support and integration. On the other, maintaining ties with Russia. Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan has tried to strike a balance. Last year, Parliament passed law to launch a process of joining the EU. And in May, Pashinyan hosted a summit with EU leaders and told them Armenia is not an ally of Russia when it comes to the Ukraine war. That comment garnered a strong response from Russian President Vladimir Putin, who threatened measures on Yerevan. Moscow has considerable influence over Armenia. It is part of Putin's Eurasian Economic Union, which encourages the free movement of goods and services in the region. Russia also supplies Armenia with more than 82% of its natural gas tax-free, and at a discount rate below market prices. And Armenia exports about 90% of its fruit, vegetables, and flowers to Russia. It also hosts a Russian military base. Another election issue is the aftermath of the long-running dispute over Nagorno-Karabakh, which dates back to the end of the USSR. It had been internationally recognized as part of Azerbaijan, which took full control of the territory in 2023 after a series of conflicts. Supporters of Pashinyan say he has the country on the right trajectory.
I really like how Armenia has been growing right before our eyes. I've worked in different places and have seen a great deal, including different presidents and the previous Prime Minister. I very much like the actions of our current Prime Minister.
But others say more work needs to be done.
I even voted for Nikol Pashinyan. I believed in him. But today we see how young people are living, the poverty. I don't even want to talk about what young people and students are using in schools. The stealing is much greater and the corruption has not ended. They can't say there is no corruption.
But whatever the outcome, the results of Sunday's vote will be closely watched from Washington, Moscow, and Brussels. Imran Ullah Khan, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Right, for more, let's bring in our guests now from Yerevan. We are joined by Richard Giragosian, Director of Regional Studies Centre think tank. In New York is Kenneth Roth, visiting professor at the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. And all the way from London is Chris Weafer, Chief Executive Officer of Micro Advisory. Thank you all, gentlemen, for joining me. Richard, I'll start with you. What's fueling the interest around this election? What are the crucial issues to the people of Armenia this time round?
Well, of course, there's an underlying geopolitical context, as we've already pointed out. But actually, this election is pivotal from a local perspective for two other reasons. First and foremost, this is a referendum on policy, on the direction of the country in terms of sustaining the momentum of positive diplomatic engagement, normalization with its neighbors, And secondly, this is a pivotal election for the future of democratization in Armenia, especially after some worrying signs and concerns. Yet we do expect Armenia to achieve its third back-to-back genuinely free and fair election tomorrow.
Kenneth, can I ask you, Richard used the phrase, talked about propelling forward off the back of what has been happening in Armenia. Have the previous promises, though, made to the Armenian people been fulfilled?
Well, the Nikol Pashinyan, the current prime minister, has proposed quite different policies for Armenia in terms of peace with Azerbaijan and Turkey and a movement, somewhat away from Russia toward the European Union. My concern, I recently visited Armenia as part of a pre-election observation mission. And our concern is that while Pashinyan, has a case to be made for why people should vote for him, he's ahead in the polls, he is cracking down on the opposition. He has arrested all sorts of opposition politicians and voices, tried to deploy state resources to tip the electoral playing field in his direction. And all of this is bad for Armenia's democracy. So I was there, not to take positions among the competing candidates, but rather to push for a free and fair election. You would think that Pashinyan would be confident enough to just, go to the polls and make his case and let the people decide, but he isn't. He's using all kinds of dirty tricks. And so, while his policies, you can make a case that this is good for Armenia, his actions in terms of undermining democracy are bad for Armenia's democracy. It's pushing the country in a more autocratic direction.
I want to talk more about what's driving that in a moment, but Chris, it does raise the question, do you then believe the people of Armenia are headed into free and fair elections?
Generally, yes. I mean, obviously, as the previous speaker said, there has been, a crackdown on any opposition voices. The Pashinyan's government has certainly made it very difficult for any opposition kind of funding or political voices or any kind of people who kind of are not, if you like, aligned with his party. But in general, I think the sense is that the elections are fair, are free, but it's going to be very tight. Pashinyan really needs to get a 2/3 majority if he wants to pursue the constitutional changes and to move the country towards Europe. And the opinion polls show a significant amount of people who are either unwilling to say what their voting preference will be when they're asked, or they are simply undecided. So it's very, very open, I think, in terms of what the result will be.
When we look at that shift to where people might be looking to put their vote, Richard, Pashinyan has earmarked this as an election focused on independence and peace. Do you think that's a fair or an accurate or realistic representation of the core issue at hand?
Well, it's actually a very effective and winning political message because the incumbent government can justifiably point out they have moved the country closer to peace than ever before and greatly reduced the risk of renewed hostilities with its neighbors. At the same time, the government is likely to be re-elected with a working majority, well short of a 2/3 majority, as Chris mentioned. But I do want to highlight what Ken said. There has been serious concern where the government has too often given into the temptation to take shortcuts, to cut corners in governance. What I would add, however, is the opposition is very much worse. And for most undecided voters, they'll vote for the government as the lesser of two evils, as well as an opposition that is deeply discredited and consistently unpopular in today's Armenia.
Kenneth, is it a case of better the devil you know?
Well, I mean, first of all, the opposition isn't in power. So, they may well be worse if they get in power, but they're not. The party in power now is civil contract, Pashinyan's party, and it is behaving in an autocratic manner. And, I think that while, this argument, that I'm the peace candidate is a powerful argument, the other side is saying, well, you lost Nagorno-Karabakh, on your watch. Now you're trying to make a virtue of necessity by making peace with Azerbaijan and Turkey, but that's because you completely lost. And so, that's a powerful argument. About 120,000 refugees from Nagorno-Karabakh want back. Azerbaijan is holding political prisoners from Nagorno-Karabakh. Pashinyan just doesn't talk about these issues. And so, there is an argument on the other side. I mean, as I say, I don't take positions here. I think, a lot of the opposition is pro-Russian, which has its own set of problems. Pashinyan is saying we want to move closer to the European Union. Membership is, nowhere near. But things like free visa access and the like could be. So it's an attractive message. I'm not denying that. It's just that Pashinyan didn't have the self-confidence to make that case to the public without cheating. And the fairness of an election is not just are the votes counted on election day. I don't anticipate big problems there with a fair count. A fairness of an election has to look at the campaign period. And if opposition voices are silenced, if opposition leaders are imprisoned, that is a tilted playing field. That's not a free and fair electoral context.
It's not just opposition voices. There are also voices in support of Pashinyan, Chris. One of them, the US President, Donald Trump. Were you surprised by him putting his weight behind the incumbent? And also, what do you think the US has to gain from taking a position here?
Excuse me. No, it's not a surprise that the US supports Pashinyan because, of course, as Ken mentioned, the opposition generally is regarded as being kind of pro-Russian and would move the country kind of closer to Moscow. So the US obviously wants to, to break or to continue, I suppose, weakening Moscow's influence in the Caucasus. And Armenia basically is the last country that Russia can claim, if you like, to have some, influence with or presence in. It has a military base there, which it doesn't have, of course, in the other two countries. Armenia is a member of the Eurasia Economic Union, which gives it free trade access to the Russian market as well as the other member states. So the US and Europe have been partly targeting Armenia in order to continue weakening Russia's position. But also, it's part of the broader strategy from Washington. The US has, and both Europe and the US have been increasing their kind of, their activities and their investment across the Caucasus. There are some very significant projects, for example, the so-called Middle Transport Corridor, which is a rail link connecting Europe and China that bypasses Russia. It goes through Georgia and Azerbaijan across the Caspian. And there's also, of course, significant hydrocarbon resources, particularly in Azerbaijan, which is going to Europe. The US has, ramped up its interest in the region. Last year, of course, we had the summit or the meeting between President Aliyev and Prime Minister Pashinyan with President Trump in the US. And the US continues to focus its efforts on investment in what it refers to as the TRIP corridor. This is the previously known as the Zenegor corridor, which is the strip of land connecting Azerbaijan with Turkey along the Armenian-Iranian border. And the US wants to develop this as another transport route and wants US investors to have a significant role in it. So for those reasons, the US definitely wants Prime Minister Pashinyan to win and win well.
Richard, can I ask there, Chris brought up this growing closeness of the relationship with Europe, and we have seen certainly even some recent events being held in Armenia, European leaders visiting and the like. Who's doing the wooing? Is it Armenia to the EU, or does Europe really want to draw Armenia in?
Well, to be fair, part of the problem is EU engagement based on a different agenda than Armenia's national interest. In other words, many in the European Union welcome Armenia as the new Georgia, the new darling of the West in terms of the leading democracy in the South Caucasus, and any country that pushes back against Russia after its failed invasion of Ukraine takes on added significance. But I would criticize, for example, the French president for being more pro-Armenian than the Armenians. It's not always helpful. And at the same time, I do think this embrace of the West loses sight of our nuanced geopolitical position. But I do want to add, as an American who moved to Armenia, I'm very skeptical about the U.S. commitment and the national interest of the U.S. It's the European Union that is more effective in terms of engaging in Armenian reform, and it's also less provocative to Russia over the longer term.
Kenneth, that is an issue, isn't it, about being provocative to Russia? And we have seen that the Speaker, the Vice President of Armenia's parliament, saying Russia has been a close partner for us. We want that to continue. What do you read that as meaning for Armenia?
Well, Armenia is economically very dependent on Russia. There's no question about that. And Putin is already using, economic threats, economic retaliation to try to affect the vote. My problem has been, both the United States and European governments have been much more concerned with the geopolitical contest with Russia than they have been with preserving Armenia's democracy. Now, this is no surprise from Trump. Trump never sees an autocratically inclined president whom he doesn't like. You don't look to Trump to defend democracy when he's trying to undermine it in the United States. But with the European Union, I did expect more. It was previously mentioned the so-called European political community, which is something set up by French President Macron after Putin's invasion of Ukraine to try to, bolster democracy in opposing Russia. And the European political community met in Yerevan, Armenia's capital, just a month ago. This was a virtual endorsement of Pashinyan. It was all about the need to fend off Russian influence, nothing about how Pashinyan was undermining Armenia's democracy. The next day, the European Union had a summit with Pashinyan. Again, all about Russia, nothing about what Pashinyan is doing for democracy. And so what we see, with European governments that should know better, they are, supposedly protecting Armenia's democracy from Russian efforts to undermine it, but utterly ignoring Pashinyan's own efforts to undermine Armenia's democracy. This is a very one-dimensional view of the problem. It undermines the credibility of the European Union. It makes, its defense of democracy purely geopolitical. They do it when it's convenient, not when it isn't. But it really also is not good for Armenia because, I think we all assume Pashinyan's going to win. The only question is by how much. But he's essentially had a European endorsement of his autocratic tendencies. That bodes very poorly for Armenia's democratic future.
Chris, it begs the question then, how concerned are you about allegations of any kind of outside influence?
Yeah, look, I think just reading back what Ken said about Europe and the US, we've seen this. We are seeing this kind of, I suppose you could almost call it hypocritical approach from the West in Central Asia as well as the Caucasus, because countries in the region are very useful for both Europe and the US. They in Central Asia, of course, they're a big source of uranium and critical minerals. The Caucasus, as I mentioned, the transport links. And kind of weakening Russia's position. It basically means that there has been zero criticism of kind of, political suppression across the entire Caucasus and Central Asian region. The laws that have been passed in several countries, for example, anti-LGBT laws, etc., which would normally, bring, howls of protests from Brussels and previously from the US, have been passed across the region without any comment whatsoever from either Brussels or Washington, because they want to work with the countries, A, to reduce Moscow, continue to reduce Moscow's influence, and B, because they want access strategically, either big transport links or critical minerals. So in that sense, there may be kind of question marks over the vote tomorrow, but there'll be, if Pashinyan wins, there will be zero criticism from Brussels or Washington, in the same way that there was very heavy criticism against the election results in Georgia, but that won't happen in Armenia because it's too important to the West. But otherwise, sorry, to answer your question about interference, the government has been kind of highlighting the risk of interference, particularly, of course, focusing on Russia. For example, people who are arriving now on flights from Moscow are being given a flyer or a handout at the airport saying that it is, pointing out that if they come to Armenia to vote and are being paid by a foreign government, i.e. Russia, then it is a criminal offense and they will be prosecuted. So the government is really kind of, focusing on the threat of interference, particularly from Russia, and they're taking action against it. But
Richard, at the 2 points there that I want to pick up on that Chris made. First was about what EU and what the West wants and what they might get over the long term could be entirely different to what's realistically achievable in the short term, but perhaps illustrated by that last point. Armenia seems to be pushing back against this Russian influence, and yet it has this sort of symbiotic relationship of sorts. It relies on Russia, it benefits from Russia, and yet that reliance means it realistically has no chance of escaping Russia, at least in the short term.
Well, Armenia's position regarding Russia is both more than it seems and less than it seems. In terms of a new strategy by this Armenian government, much more transactional in its approach with Russia, I would categorize it as passive-aggressive. It's a much more practical, pragmatic balancing act. For example, Armenia, despite deepening ties with the EU, remains committed to staying a member of Putin's Eurasian Economic Union. It has frozen its contributions to Russia's Collective Security Treaty Organization, yet has not withdrawn from it. So it's literally a balancing act. And I think it's based on a realistic post-war assessment of this new reality. Nevertheless, what we do see is genuine demonstrable diplomatic progress between Armenia and Azerbaijan, Armenia and Turkey, without any third-party involvement. Neither the West nor Russia is a player or facilitator in that process. So I do think the outlook for the day after the election is much more significant, much more interesting, but also much more unpredictable.
Transactional politics, Kenneth, which seems to be the way a lot of the world is going. Can a closer relationship with Western Europe ever replace Armenia's relationship at the moment with Russia?
I mean, at the moment, no. At the moment, Armenia is very economically dependent on Russia. I think the longer term hope is that, first of all, if there is peace with Turkey, that's a big market right next door. That could play a significant role. Obviously, if there are closer economic ties to the European Union, particularly, reduction of tariffs and the like, that could be enormously important. So, there are potential long-term benefits. The question is how to get through this transitional period. I mean, Putin is already shutting down imports of certain Armenian vegetables and the like. He's turning the screws. He's trying to influence the election. That seems to be backfiring, if anything. I mean, I don't think Armenian people are happy to receive that kind of overt pressure from Putin. And of course, what Putin is offering, which is autocracy, dominance by the Kremlin, this is not an attractive vision. The opposition in Armenia does talk about Nagorno-Karabakh. The idea of winning it back is a pipe dream. I mean, the idea that Pashinyan is trying to make peace with Azerbaijan is making a virtue of necessity. Azerbaijan is, far more powerful militarily at this point, and it was only Russia's defensive effort that protected Nagorno-Karabakh for so long. But with Putin preoccupied in Ukraine, the Azerbaijanis just overran Nagorno-Karabakh fairly easily. So, I think that there is quite a bit to be made for Pashinyan's shift. He just seems to be afraid to make that case openly to the Armenian people and to let them freely choose. He's trying to tilt the electoral playing field. And, as I said, what's disappointing is, the European Union seems not capable of, on the one hand, saying we like Pashinyan's pro-European policies, but we also don't like his efforts to undermine democracy. That would have been a principled approach. It wouldn't do that. The European Union was just as transactional, just as pragmatic, just as unprincipled as Pashinyan seems to be. So, that's what's been really disappointing here. The European Union in Ukraine is fighting not only to fend off Russia, but also to protect Ukraine's democracy. In Armenia, all it's doing is fending off Russia. It's letting Armenia's democracy be undermined by Armenia's own leader.
Chris, I'll come to you. I want to try and get Richard in once more before the end of the show. So what is the issue that you feel Armenians then, given that there is so much of geopolitical influence or interest in this election, what will Armenians be looking for in respect of how they are treated regionally, do you think, Chris?
Yeah, I think that's the the issue obviously for Armenians is to some extent it's a big leap of faith. If you like, moving away from Russia and assuming that Europe and the US will fill that void. There is an enormous kind of short-term risk that the country faces. 80% of the gas that it uses comes from Russia. Armenia pays less than 1/3 of the price that Europe pays for gas. It would cost the country about an additional $700 or $800 million a year to import gas, presumably from neighboring Azerbaijan. If it loses the Russian gas, 36% of foreign trade turnover is directly with Russia, and another 15%, which is with the United Arab Emirates, is indirectly linked to Russia. Armenia imports rough diamonds from Russia. It has a very big jewelry industry, and then the end product it makes from the diamond and gold it imports from Russia goes to the UAE. So losing kind of those materials and access to cheap energy, which President Putin said would happen very quickly, then that could certainly have a very significant negative impact on the economy for several years, even if Armenia is then able to, as Richard said, engage with Turkey, which is a big market next door. And if we start to see some investment picking up from Europe and the US, there will be a several-year period of a lot of economic pain that the country will face if the relationship with Russia breaks down.
Gentlemen, I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Thank you very much for your insight and your thoughts. Richard Giragosian, Director of the Regional Studies Centre think tank. From New York, joining us, Kenneth Roth, Visiting Professor at the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. And from London, Chris Weafer, Chief Executive Officer of Macro Advisory. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is AJ Inside Story. For now, that's it. From me, Anna Burns-Francis, and the team here, Al Jazeera's coverage continues in a moment. Stay tuned.